go back.
Okay, back again. So as we go through my cat says hi, as we move towards how did these group of Yahwists go from being one small religious group in a little stretch of land in Palestine to being a true world religion? And a lot of that basically we set the scene for that with the fall of the temple. So in 587, the Babylonians attack the city after a series of poor choices by the leadership of Jerusalem. The city is attacked actually several times over the course of 10 to 15 years, but in 587, 586, the city walls are destroyed and the temple is taken down. And the people then are taken into exile in Babylon. So a couple things about this. There's a huge theological crisis based on this. In the ancient world, every nation had a god, and if my god, if I conquered, if my army conquered your army, then my god was also conquering your god. And so does this mean, Yahweh wasn't protecting them? Does this mean Yahweh wasn't even real or worthy of worship? And what they came up with was a very specific theology that of God's punishment, that when the Babylonian army attacked them, God was punishing them for their lack of faithfulness to the law, and that meant not that God was less powerful than the Babylonian God, but was in fact in control of all forces and could use them in order to accomplish God's will, Yahweh's will. And so they flipped what would have been, in many senses, an ending to the belief in Yahwism. This could have been a crisis that ended this religion, but what Judaism survives because of how it thinks about its relationship with God and its and this idea of God in control of everything. So this understanding, this theological understanding of what goes on there, creates the next step towards true monotheism. So this ethical voice of the prophets and God's high expectations for the people turns into or becomes a step towards what you and I today would think of as true monotheism. So that's the sort of theological issue that goes on very briefly. But then also a couple other things. Yay. Go on as well. What else? So let me get back. So so we've talked about the theology, scripture. Part of the exile, taking that large number of educated people into exile, was the beginning of moving from an oral culture to a written culture. And preservation. What do you do when your country is attacked? You're now basically a refugee. This idea of preservation is the first impetus for collecting and preserving the traditions of the people, which eventually then become, much of it, our Bible, the Hebrew Bible, or the Jewish written tradition. And of course, diaspora then, we talk a lot about it in the Hellenistic period, but it really begins here. Diaspora is the idea of Jews living, or should I say Hebrews, Jews, it's too soon to call them Jews. The Israelite people now living all over the known world in essence. So they're in Babylon, they're in other, some have fled to Egypt in this period. So we have the move along with all this theological movement to the idea that Israel or the worship of Yahweh is no longer confined to a particular geographical location. And that's a big step forward too. By the way, this is the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. This is the Ishtar Gate. It is the small gate, but this was the ceremonial entrance to the city of Babylon in ancient times. And like I said, this was the small gate. There was a larger gate and a mile long road, basically, of these blue tiles with these mythological figures. It was an impressive, impressive place. And it's really fascinating to me that the Hebrew people, the people of Israel or Judah, go there and end up stronger and rejecting what they saw going on in worship and all that, and rejected the gods of the Babylonians and moved towards monotheism. So the diaspora. Then, of course, the Babylonians fall, the Persians show up, and so for the Persian period, you have a very stable period in the biblical time period, fall of Babylon to Cyrus, the turn of the exiles and temple objects to Judah. And this is a very prosperous period. And so we get the continued preservation of the religion and their faith and their written tradition. More writings, books like Job come from this period, and other really significant books. But also the Persian influence on and Zoroastrianism on the Hebrew people is very much an important element to remember. We are not studying Zoroastrianism in this class. There are a few people who still practice it. There were in Iran and in India, but it is the religion of the Persian period. And it is from the Persians that we get this strong sense of good versus evil, and a lot of apocalyptic imagery comes out of the Persian influence on religion, on the Hebrew people. They are no longer a nation. They are just a colony or a province within the larger Persian period. We get the rebuilding of the Second Temple. This is why we call this period the Second Temple. And from this point on, we see some people are even call this period early Judaism. The Judaism that is practiced today has its it may have had its deep roots in the period before this, but this is where its roots begin. And so, of course, again, we are no longer looking at a people who have safe, protected borders where everybody in the nation worships the same thing. They are a colony, a province of Persia. But after the Persians fall to Alexander the Great, basically they're a colony of whatever king happens to control them. So the Hellenistic period, and of course with Hellenism, the Greek idea of Greek culture, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, all these other groups, they had no concern about cultural domination. It was about power and money. But Alexander did not only wanted to control the world, but he wanted to. He thought that the Greek culture was the best culture in the world, superior to all others. So he basically attempted to turn everybody in all of his conquered populations into good Greeks. So this is a first, really. Why we put so much emphasis on Hellenism versus Babylonianism or even the Persians, whereas there's always influence when you have contact. It wasn't until the Greek influence and those who followed Alexander that there was an attempt to actually impose foreign culture, foreign religion onto the Hebrew people or the people of Palestine. And so this then sets up a different situation as well. This is the birthplace of modern Judaism. So Hellenism, and then of course we start to see the earliest synagogues. Synagogue is a Jewish house of worship. Um, and so as there are more and more individuals in the diaspora, you have the need to find a way to worship that does not involve the temple, and that is where the synagogue comes in, and it is what indeed survives and becomes the basis of modern Judaism. So we move into the same period as the beginnings of Christianity. In some ways, Christianity and Judaism are born at the same time. The Romans take control of Palestine in 63 BCE. It becomes a problematic province for them, and a lot of that has to do with the cultural influence, polytheism versus monotheism, and particularly the Roman concept of Roman civil religion. So Roman civil religion, we study this also when we talk about the beginnings of Christianity, because it was the Roman belief, this idea of the Pax Romana, the great peace and prosperity, the greatness of Rome, and that's the Latin word for peace, was supported by the power of the Roman gods. So Romans gods, if they were taken care of properly, would then turn around and support and keep Rome great. And so the Romans, unlike any conquering group up to this point, required all its conquered populations, all conquered populations, to worship or participate in some small way the worship of the Roman gods. And so while this did not go over well with the Jewish people, and so the Roman government, the Roman Senate, declared Judaism, which we can now sort of begin to call it that, a legal religion in the Roman Empire, which basically meant that they did not have to participate in this. So Jews were given an exemption. So it's kind of a weird thing to think about. People practiced a multitude of different religions in the Roman Empire. It was a very interesting time in terms of religious movements. But it was only Judaism that said, we can't worship the Roman God. So if you were part of one of the mystery cults or these ancient Roman religions, that was not mutually exclusive. Only Judaism was mutually exclusive. And so that was what set them on the collision course. And so it was not always easy, but Judaism was, by the way, a highly respected religion in the Roman Empire for its for its ethical and ethical responses and its dedication. And hold on, sometimes I can't talk. Let's just erase all this. So it wasn't that they disliked the Jews, it was just a clash of cultural understandings and the belief that in some ways they were not being good Roman citizens because they were not worshiping the Roman gods. It was okay for them not to, but that still didn't stop the sort of suspicion that we see of groups that are different. And so that's all sort of around this 63 and on. Now in about the year 68, now we're talking CE, so this is after the birth and death of Jesus, a group in Jerusalem locked down the temple and attempt to remove the Romans from Jerusalem. This sets up a siege that lasts for about 2 years. You literally have different parts of the city controlled by the Romans and by various Jewish groups, and just chaos until eventually the city falls to the Romans. But here's something we don't talk a lot about in 125 or Old Testament survey. It really has more to do with the development of Judaism. In about the year 68, 69, a man named Yohanan ben Zakkai, who was a part of the Pharisee. So we hear about those in the New Testament, but they're actually much nicer guys than the New Testament would have us believe. Yohanan ben Zakkai goes to the Roman general, or sends a message to the general who is running the siege against Jerusalem, and asks for permission to leave the city, safe passage to go to a town on the seacoast called Jamnia, or Yavna is its Hebrew name. He is given permission. He is able to make it out of the city safely. He goes along with some of his fellow Pharisees, rabbis, and teachers, and founds a school at Yavna. And this is the birth, if you're going to put a date on it, this is the birth of the rabbinic movement, and it is the birth of Judaism in its modern form. We talk about them in our other classes because it is the school at Yavna or Jamnia that what we would call the Old Testament, but the Hebrew Bible comes into its final form. So again, the destruction of the temple, and then of course the temple is destroyed in 70, a major watershed event. It is not rebuilt even to this day. And so you have then coalescing of events, Yohanan ben Zakkai and his school in Jamnia, the Hebrew Bible coming into its final form, and we have modern Judaism, or at least the beginnings of it. And so I did want to show you this picture. This is actually in Rome. If you go to Rome, it's within visual distance of the Colosseum. And this is the arch that commemorates the sacking of the city of Jerusalem. So you can see the menorah and various other religious objects from the temple. And so at this point, we have the development of modern Judaism. So the diaspora, the destruction of the temple, and then the synagogue. This is where Judaism survives. The Jews that live in other places, and the idea of the synagogue. And to have a synagogue, here's an ancient picture of the special box to hold the Torah. You've got the synagogue, which must have a copy of the scriptures, and then to go to start a service, you need 10 Jewish males, and that's what the bar mitzvah is about. You become an adult male with at 13, and then you can form part of the minyan. And this is the foundation of Judaism: a copy of the scripture and 10 Jewish men in a community together. Synagogue, or should I say Christian worship, is based on synagogue worship. So the very things that we think of, the idea of scripture reading and talking about scripture, singing and praising, reading the Psalms, and of course the collection of money for charity. And I should put that up there too, obviously, prayer. But the idea of, and so in some very fundamental ways, we understand what goes on in a synagogue if we've also been in a church. So again, I will pause here